There is a number sitting quietly in the bond market this week that most Americans have never heard of, and almost none of them understand. It is 5.2%. That is the yield on the 30-year United States Treasury bond as of May 19th of this year, the highest level that number has reached since July of 2007, before the financial crisis swallowed a generation's worth of household wealth. I want you to stay with me for a moment because I know that the 30-year Treasury yield sounds like the kind of phrase only a Wall Street analyst would care about. But I am going to show you why that number 5.2% is already sitting inside your mortgage payment, your credit card balance, your car loan, and your retirement account, whether you know it or not. And I am going to tell you how we got here, because the road we took to arrive at 5.2% is not a complicated one. It is actually a very simple story about what happens when a household or a nation spends more than it earns, year after year, decade after decade, and finally runs into a creditor who says, "I need to be paid more to keep lending to you." I am not here to tell you who caused this. I am not here to tell you which party is to blame, or which president should have done something different. I have been watching markets for more than 70 years, and I have watched a remarkable number of politicians from both sides of the aisle make promises that arithmetic eventually had to correct. What I am here to do is read the situation plainly, explain the mechanism, and help you think clearly about what it means for your family and your money. Let me lay out what actually happened, because facts matter more than feelings in this business. On May 16th of this year, Moody's Ratings downgraded the credit rating of the United States government from AAA to AA1. That is a one-notch reduction on a 21-notch scale, a modest-sounding move with immodest consequences. Moody's had been the last of the three major rating agencies to maintain a perfect AAA rating on American debt. Standard & Poor's stripped that rating in 2011. Fitch removed it in 2023. And now Moody's has followed. For the first time in the 109-year history of the agency's relationship with American debt, the United States government does not hold a perfect credit rating from any of the three firms that matter to the global bond market. The agency cited two primary reasons. First, the sustained growth of the federal debt driven by rising spending and reduced tax revenues. Second, the ballooning cost of servicing that debt as interest rates have risen. Moody's now projects that federal debt could reach 134% of gross domestic product by 2035, up from its already elevated level today. The Congressional Budget Office, a nonpartisan institution, has been making similar projections for years. This was not a surprise, it was a verdict. Running alongside the Moody's action is the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, signed into law last July, which extended the 2017 tax cuts and added new ones, raised the debt ceiling by $5 trillion to $41.1 trillion, and which the Congressional Budget Office estimates will add $3.4 trillion to the national debt over the next 10 years. $3.4 trillion. Written out in the script body the way I prefer, $3.4 trillion of additional debt over 10 years. At a time when the government is already spending roughly 18 cents of every revenue dollar simply to pay interest on what it already owes. The bond market heard that number, and it responded. Now, here is the way I look at it. When I evaluate a business, and I have evaluated a great many of them over the years, the first thing I do is read the balance sheet. Not the press release, not the earnings headline, not the CEO's letter to shareholders, the balance sheet. Because the balance sheet does not have a public relations department. It just shows you the assets, the liabilities, and the gap between them. The United States government's balance sheet right now shows a gap that has been widening for 25 years across multiple administrations and multiple Congresses, and bond markets, which are populated by people whose job is to read balance sheets for a living, have decided that they need to be compensated more for the privilege of lending to a borrower with that balance sheet. That is what a rising yield means. It is not a mysterious market phenomenon. It is buyers of treasury bonds saying, "We want more return because we perceive more risk." When the 30-year treasury yield goes from 3% to 5.2%, the government's cost of borrowing for long-term projects rises dramatically. And because the government's cost of borrowing anchors virtually every other long-term borrowing rate in the American economy, the ripple spreads. This is where the incentives start to matter. My partner Charlie Munger, my partner of more than 50 years, used to say, "Show me the incentive, and I'll show you the outcome." Let us apply that discipline here. The politician's incentive is to make promises today that someone else has to pay for tomorrow. The tax cut feels good now. The spending program wins votes now. The bill comes due later, often much later, often to a different Congress, a different president, a different generation of voters. That incentive structure has been in place for decades, and Moody's just summarized its cumulative effect in a single credit rating action. The incentive of the bond investor is different. The bond investor is not voting for anyone. The bond investor is doing arithmetic. And when the arithmetic suggests that a borrower's debt load is rising faster than its income, the bond investor demands a higher rate, not as a punishment, as compensation for risk. That is not moral philosophy. That is just the way lending has worked since the first merchant in Babylon agreed to loan grain to his neighbor, and the people caught between those two sets of incentives, between the political class that made the promises and the bond market that is now repricing the cost of those promises, are ordinary American families who are trying to buy a house, or keep the one they have, or save enough for retirement, or avoid drowning in credit card debt. Those are the people who feel the yield curve in their lives, even if they have never heard the phrase yield curve in their lives. Let me make this concrete, because in my line of work, the numbers tell you what the headlines often hide. According to Freddie Mac, as of the week ending May 21st, the average rate on a 30-year fixed mortgage in the United States is 6.51%. That number has been rising over the past week as 10-year Treasury yields climbed more than 0.2 of a percentage point in a single week. According to Bankrate, the national median family income for 2026 is $106,800. The median price of an existing home sold in April of this year was $417,700. On a 20% down payment of roughly $83,000, the remaining loan balance is $334,000. At 6.51% over 30 years, the monthly principal and interest payment on that loan is approximately $2,112. That is about 24% of the median family's monthly gross income, and that is before property taxes, homeowners insurance, or homeowners association fees. Meanwhile, the Yale Budget Lab projects that if Treasury yields rise an additional 1.2 percentage points over the coming decades, which its models suggest the debt trajectory could produce, mortgage rates follow. And a family that might have paid $2,100 a month on a 30-year mortgage at today's rates could find itself paying closer to $2,450. That additional $350 a month is $4,200 a year, paid every year for 30 years. That is not abstract. That is a vacation that does not happen. That is a retirement contribution that does not get made. That is a college fund that does not compound the way it was supposed to. Now let me talk about compounding, because compounding is the most powerful force in finance and the most underappreciated force in everyday life. Most people understand how compounding works in their favor. A dollar saved and invested patiently becomes something remarkable over decades. What they forget is that compounding works in reverse too. The federal government currently spends roughly 18 cents of every dollar of revenue on interest payments alone. Moody's projects that figure could rise to 30 cents by 2035. 30 cents of every dollar before a single road gets built, before a single soldier gets paid, before a single Medicare claim gets processed. That is the compounding of deferred financial reckoning. Every year that the gap between spending and revenue widens, the interest cost grows, which widens the gap further, which grows the interest cost further. It is not a complicated mechanism. It is exactly the same arithmetic that destroys households that run on credit cards they never pay off. The interest compounds, and the balance grows, until the lender recalculates the rate. Foreign holders of dollar-denominated assets benefit from the carry. Defense contractors and industries whose contracts are funded by deficit spending continue to receive their orders regardless of the yield level. Politicians benefit from the short-term sugar of tax cuts and spending programs paid for on the nation's credit card, while the yield consequences arrive quietly and are easily blamed on markets, on foreign actors, on whoever held the office before. The people who pay are the ones who always pay. The family trying to buy their first home at 6.5%, when 2 years ago it was possible to find rates below 3%. The small business owner, whose line of credit is tied to prime rate. The young couple carrying 17% credit card debt, because their income has not kept pace with inflation, while their borrowing costs have climbed. The retiree, whose bond portfolio has lost value as yields rose and prices fell. The taxpayer who will eventually watch the government reduce services not because of political will but because the interest bill leaves no room for anything else. That is the most dangerous arrangement in any organization, public or private. When the person making the decision does not feel the cost of the decision. The legislator who votes for a tax cut or a spending program today will not personally write the check when the 30-year bond yield is repriced tomorrow, but a family in Ohio or Georgia or Arizona will feel it in their mortgage statement every single month. Let me now talk about the range of what comes next. I do not predict. Anyone who tells you they can predict the macroeconomic future with precision is either fooling you or fooling themselves, and usually both. But I can lay out the range of outcomes. The optimistic case: Congress, facing the bond market's verdict, negotiates a credible medium-term fiscal plan, some combination of spending restraint and revenue adjustment, that gives bond investors reason to believe the trajectory is changing. Treasury yields ease back below 4.5%. Mortgage rates follow. The cost of homeownership becomes more accessible. The Federal Reserve gains room to consider rate adjustments. Markets respond positively. This outcome is possible. It has historical precedent. The Graham-Rudman-Hollings Act of 1985 and the Budget Enforcement Act of 1990, for all their imperfections, represented moments when Congress actually constrained itself. It can happen again. I would just not count on it without seeing the signed legislation. The base case, and this is the one history suggests is most likely, is a managed drift. Yields stay elevated in the mid to upper 4% range on the 10-year and near 5% on the 30-year. Mortgage rates hold in the mid to upper 6s. The housing market remains largely frozen for first-time buyers who cannot afford the monthly payment, while existing homeowners stay put rather than trade their 3% mortgage for a 6% one. Inflation stays stickier than the Federal Reserve would like. The Fed holds rates steady or makes very modest reductions. The debt continues to grow, and future Congresses face choices that are progressively more constrained. Nobody declares a crisis. Nobody solves anything structural. The cost compounds quietly, year by year, inside every household in America that carries debt. The cautionary case is the one I would want every serious investor to think carefully about. Not to panic over, but to think about. If the debt trajectory continues without any meaningful response, and if global investors, including the large foreign holders of American Treasury securities, begin to reduce their appetite for United States debt in a more significant way, the Treasury would be forced to offer even higher yields to attract buyers. The dollar's share in global reserves, already at roughly 57.8% according to the International Monetary Fund, a 30-year low, could decline further. At some point, higher yields push equity valuations lower because the risk-free rate competes with stock returns. Retirement accounts, which hold trillions of dollars in a mix of stocks and bonds, would face pressure from both sides. This scenario does not require a dramatic crash. It can arrive the way most financial deterioration arrives, slowly, and then all at once. I am not predicting this. I am telling you it is possible, and that the people holding the policy levers have not, in my view, demonstrated the willingness to make it structurally impossible. I want to close the way I would close a letter to a business partner. The thing to understand about the 30-year Treasury yield, about 5.2%, and what it means, is that it is not really a story about bond markets. It is a story about arithmetic, and arithmetic, unlike politics, is not interested in your preferred narrative. It does not care which side you voted for, or which television network you watch, or whether you believe the debt is manageable or catastrophic. The arithmetic simply continues compounding, in whichever direction the decisions point it. What you can control is your own household balance sheet. And in 60 years of watching people make financial decisions, I have never found a better foundation than this. Live below your means. Hold a margin of safety. A little extra cash. I have been an optimist about this country for my entire adult life, and I remain one. But optimism is not the same as wishful thinking. Optimism has to be grounded in the recognition that the problems are real, that the arithmetic is real, and that the only way through is patient, disciplined, honest reckoning with both. The bond market has started that reckoning. The question is whether the rest of us, including the people we send to Washington, are ready to join it. Take care of yourself, and take care of your family.